A recent New York Times Siena College poll shows that 49% of likely voters polled plan to vote Republican in the upcoming midterms, compared to 45% who plan to vote Democrat, an improvement for the GOP from September. The biggest shift came from voters who identified as both women and independent. In September, this cohort favored Democrats by 14 points, but now favors the GOP by 18 points.
Joining us now to discuss is host of Straight Shot No Chaser podcast, Tezlyn Figaro, and senior policy analyst at the Independent Women's Forum, Inez Stepman. Welcome to you both.
Thanks. Thank you.
Inez, what do you think explains this fairly rapid reversal in favor of the GOP, reversal of Democrats' fortunes with this specific group?
Yeah, I mean, I think it goes back to other polls that repeatedly show that the top issues in this election are the economy and inflation. And by the way, as a third place consistently across different polls, immigration. And voters see, and especially independent women see, the Republican Party addressing those issues. And they are not swayed only by abortion. So I think what the New York Times had a quote from one of the voters that I thought encapsulated the data pretty well in that article, which is, she said, "I am concerned about Roe v. Wade being overturned, but I'm concerned about other things." And I think that's a pretty good encapsulation of why this group has swung so fast. Although I would caution, this is a poll of just over 300 people. The margin of error could be pretty large. I think that still there is that swing. There is some kind of swing of independent women. I would be a little bit cautious about this number and how large it is.
Inez, what in your view has been the productive Republican messaging on inflation? I think that you're right that they've been stressing that in lieu of issues like abortion, but it's not clear to me that there's been an affirmative plan articulated by Republicans as opposed to just criticisms of what Democrats are or aren't doing on that score.
Yeah, I mean, I actually have to agree with you. I don't think Republicans have been very clear about anything about what they actually want to do. And that's somewhat by design, right? Their Republican leadership has been afraid to actually put forward an agenda. They're relying on how unpopular Joe Biden is. And that may be a good strategy for the election, but it's not necessarily a good strategy for after the election, right? They actually need to put forward a plan and actually show how they're going to fix some of these issues if they expect to retain popularity and actually do something good for the country. But yeah, I actually agree with your criticism. I don't think the Republican Party has been clear about what it wants to do about inflation or just about anything else. And that, I think, is by design from the leadership.
Tezlyn, what do you think Democrats need to do to be competitive, more competitive with this group?
Well, I'm so glad you brought up the point, Inez, about how this was only 300 people in the poll. You know, that's one of the things that I think is critically important. I have an entire training that I talk about polls in different area codes that shows you that polls are not as accurate as we would like them to be, but it is an indication to give you an idea where folks are going. I really just do believe in the NBC poll, even though, again, not completely accurate, but the NBC poll shows that 70% of registered voters are more enthusiastic, and both sides say that this is the election of our time, which they said that last time. Every 2 years they say this is the most important election. They'll say next time,
etc.
Right. So it is showing that voter enthusiasm is higher on the Republican side, 78%, 69% on the Democrat side. But again, it's really going to come down to those who really is going to get out for their team on Election Day. To answer your question more directly on what Democrats can do, I'm not trying to be pessimistic in any way. I'm just being very real. I think everything that's going to be done has been done. Not much will change in 2 weeks. People have already made their mind up. They've already decided which side they're on. And it really just comes down to how will folks be able to get out the vote, which means how many people can they actually get to the polls between now and Election Day. But I do think I will caution Democrats in basically being excited about the early numbers showing that they had a lead on early voting, because that is a strategy time and time again that folks say that, they think they already have it in the bag. And then Election Day, Republicans show up and take a lot of those seats.
Well, despite Democrats' heavy focus on abortion this election cycle, at least recently, the share of likely voters who said economic concerns were the most important issue facing America has leaped since July to 44% from 36%, far higher than any other issue. And voters most concerned with the economy favored Republicans overwhelmingly by more than a 2-to-1 margin, which speaks to what you were saying, Inez, at what point will Republicans have to explain what they are going to affirmatively do? Does that mean cutting spending? Does that mean, they've suggested some of the Ukraine spending might come at least in the House. Kevin McCarthy has talked about that. But a positive agenda for what the party's going to do. Is that a symptom of the fact that we're going to have even massive Republican victories are going to produce divided government? So the reality will be mostly thwarting what Biden does anyway, rather than putting forward what their program is.
Yeah, I don't know that they have as clear a case for what they're going to do in the future as they do going back, a sort of blaming case. I do think they have a good blaming case. They're pointing to a lot of spending that increased inflation, a lot of government packages. They're pointing more especially to the fact that closures in many states went on much longer during the pandemic than were necessary. And I think they probably will hold hearings about the decisions to lock down and especially to close schools for so long. I think they have a better case essentially blaming or a case of how we got here, blaming Democrats and blaming Joe Biden for some of the decisions that he made. I think rightfully so. They have less of a case, as you just said, for what they're actually going to do other than perhaps not pass another massive stimulus bill. But that's not really a positive case. That's just, okay, well, we'll stop doing some of the things that we think are causing the inflation that Democrats are doing, but that's not actually a positive case to deal with the economy. I do think they can rely on the pre-pandemic experience that we all still remember of a roaring U.S. economy. And by the way, gains that actually went more proportionately to blue-collar workers than in the past 30 years in terms of economic booms and busts in the United States. So I think they're going to, again, point backwards to the Trump record before the pandemic on the economy. I also think Democrats are really hampered by a couple issues that they can't stop talking about internally because a lot of their base wants to talk about them. I'm thinking about the fact that the president just gave an interview to Dylan, right, to talk about minor transition. And then also the incredible focus on climate change, when every issues poll shows that those two issues are either very unpopular or at best, they're very, very low on voters' priority lists, except for a tiny part of the Democratic base. So they have to keep talking about those issues in order to play to their base. But unlike abortion, there aren't even like a sort of substantive number of voters who are concerned about those issues. And I think, if anything, they're turning away voters by talking about those topics.
So I don't know. I've never heard any of the Biden administration be particularly vocal about climate change. I think, frankly, much to the chagrin of the left. But I will say this, Bernie Sanders has been making the point that you made earlier there, Inez, about the fact that Republicans aren't making an affirmative case. He came out saying, what they are talking about, cuts in Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, is that irresponsible? It's absolutely irresponsible. He said that on CNN recently. Tezlyn, do you think that there is room for Democrats to be making that point more strongly, that Republicans do in fact have a plan, and the reason that they're not talking about it is because the plan is largely to strip what little social safety net and support is left for folks who have been devastated by not just the COVID pandemic, but the economic decline since then, and who have been at the poor end of Trump's tax cuts, which 85% of which went to the top 1%. Is there space there for Democrats to make that point and bring that point home, or do you think there's still some legitimacy in relying on this kind of abortion approach?
Yeah, I think with less than 2 weeks in the game, my communication advice would be to not worry about trying to counter somebody else's argument and constantly chasing what Republicans are talking about and offering a defense. They really should have been building a more offense strategy to talk about what they've done. And Democrats have still not really grasped the idea of talking about what you've done. And so if Democrats believe that they have made some deliverables to the table, then they need to be talking about that. Constantly just countering, allowing Republicans to control the narrative and constantly just responding to them. It's just simply not working. Right now, there are 3 states that are really the states to watch for Senate control: Pennsylvania, Georgia, and Nevada. It really comes down to just these 3 states. So while we're talking about a national conversation on what's going on in Oklahoma or what's going on in New York, the reality is these 3 states. So looking at the economy in these 3 states matters. How are they getting out the vote in these 3 states? What messaging are they pushing in those 3 states? Because remember, Republicans only need to win one of those states where not only do Democrats have to maintain, but they also have to gain. And so they have the uphill battle. Right now, polls indicate that the Republicans will win on the House side. But again, polls are just polls. We won't know until they actually come out. But the strategy of trying to respond to Republicans has not worked. It will never work. It will constantly allow Republicans to control the narrative, to control the puppet strings, opposed to Democrats actually delivering on policy. And then when they deliver on policy, actually putting that message. So for folks who are voter depressed, what I call voter depressed, which is different than voter suppression, they don't see it. They don't see it. They don't hear it, and they don't feel it in the pocket. And that is what is really hurting Democrats. And to be honest, I just don't know how much can change within the next 10 days.
Well, Inez and Tezlyn, we got to leave it there, but thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
And stay tuned for more Rising in just a minute.